Hello, friends. It's Jim McCarthy with American Vapor Manufacturers, back for another installment of Shaping Vaping, our podcast on nicotine THR policy and related issues in the Food and Drug Administration, which we're going to touch on today with our special guest, Ted Kyle from ConscienHealth, and our recurring co-host, Joe Gitchell from Pinion Associates. Ted, kind thanks for making time for us. And I want to start by letting you just introduce yourself. You're the editor and publisher of ConscienHealth, but I don't want to, I'd rather hear firsthand from the listeners, want to hear firsthand from you, your publication and your outlook.
Sure. Well, on ConscienHealth, I publish a daily commentary that really gets a little bit into the weeds, read by probably most of the folks who have a serious stake in obesity, either from the standpoint of research and clinical care or patient advocacy and policy. And I've been doing this for, I don't know, about 8 years, 7 years, 8 years.
I've been longer than that.
Well, I've been working in the obesity space for a quarter of a century now. So before I started doing this, I was with GSK Consumer Health, which is now Haleon. I worked on the nicotine, the smoking control business, tobacco control business there. And we thought that we could take a few things that we learned in tobacco dependence business and apply them in the weight management business. And that resulted in the switch of orlistat from prescription to non-prescription status. And then from there, with all of the contacts I had with thought leaders in the space, I struck out on my own and developed ConscienHealth. And at this point, I do mostly advocacy and public policy work, mostly for the good of the cause.
Right. Well, that is terrific. And you're most kind to join us. Joe's an avid reader and contributor to your platform, and I often read through the links that he frequently provides. And today I want to talk a little bit about obesity in the FDA context. That is what contrary to what a lot of vapors think, that's what the F stands for, Joe, in FDA.
I realize there's some discourse around the acronym. Indeed.
There is. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this debate and the discourse shapes the way FDA looks at that policy. And then I want to talk a little bit too about what the THR community can learn from what I call the food wars, which have been this roiling national debate we've had over food policy for many decades, and how it shapes policy and news coverage and what kind of overlaps there are. I mean, it's striking to me that there are a lot of the figures that are now in the what I would call anti-nicotine movement have a history in the anti-food manufacturing movement. And it's a very curious overlap. And I want to dive into that a little bit. And then lastly, Joe has contributed many a piece for your fine publication on the future of nicotine policy. So we're going to go use our time machine and go back and look at the way the issue has unfolded and see whether it came to pass as was forecasted. Spoiler alert, not entirely. But let me start by asking about the obesity issue. I've had a hard time, I must confess, kind of pinning down where ConscienHealth is coming at this. On the one hand, it seems like you are very concerned about obesity policy and think that it ought to be a priority for medicine and public policy. But on the other hand, you think that a lot of the advocates in that space go too far or off base, are saying things that are hyperbolic and inaccurate. So tell me, Ted, give me your over the kitchen table to a layperson. Where do you see obesity policy? What should we be doing? What are we not doing enough of?
So I'm in favor of taking it seriously and staying grounded in facts and science. And where people have veered off the track is that they've substituted their own bias and convictions for the actual science of obesity. The fact is that obesity is a complex and chronic condition that's driven by biology And for decades, many decades, the presumption has been this is a condition of choice. And we've kind of, some of the very vocal folks, you call them advocates, I call them sort of outsiders, condescending outsiders, have presumed that it is a condition of choice driven by bad choices, and they've kind of migrated to, well, yeah, it's driven by choice, but bless their hearts, those people with obesity don't know what they're doing, and we need to put them on a good path by being a good paternalist influence and making it less possible for them to, and I'll use air quotes, be obese, because they think of obesity as an identity. And by and large, these are people who've never experienced it or never really thought about it from the standpoint of the lived experience.
Well, let me ask about where that rubber hits the road, because a lot of those various advocates, and not just consumer advocates, but also corporate entities also, and the various physicians organizations and the body part organizations, they all have a view on obesity and food policy. And I guess my question is, do you think that the government, that FDA or USDA or other federal entities ought to play a role in obesity? And if so, what should it be?
Yeah, come on, Ted, like 80 words. Just in 80 words, solve national food policy in 80 words.
Well, should go. I mean, well, hang on a second. I mean, I would say no, they don't. I know you, Joe, believe in state capacity, and there's various degrees. Should they nudge or make suggestions and recommendations, or should they legislate and regulate to try to drive towards specific outcomes? I mean, I think that's a pretty basic gradient.
They should let go of the ignorant idea that obesity is a behavioral problem that they can solve with nudges, and come at it from the standpoint of a biological problem that has multiple causes. Obesity is not caused exclusively by food. It's caused by food, by the physical environment, by the food environment, by the physical environment, by stress and stressors, and by exposures to drugs and other endocrine disruptors that alter a person's metabolism. And that scientific view of what obesity is dramatically at cross purposes with the presumption of obesity as a biological, as a behavioral problem, that you have to nudge people to stop behaving so badly. It's just, it's like thinking that you can nudge people to consume less oxygen. No, sorry, your oxygen consumption is driven by deeply encoded parts of your brain that ensure you don't suffocate.
Well, our frequent pinata of this show, Michael Bloomberg, in the world he would create, we would simply outlaw some of these categories, like sugar sodas, for example.
Yeah, since the beginning of time, people have been trying to figure out what what foods are bad and evil and
Right.
should be taboo. And the truth is that food and diet and dietary patterns are complicated little boogers. And it's not as simple as figuring out what is the bad food and just stop eating it. We've gone through many cycles of identifying the bad food and telling people, well, don't eat so much fat, or don't eat so much sugar, or don't eat so many carbs. And right now, the current preoccupation is with ultra-processed foods. And
Right.
that label of ultra-processed foods is just a surrogate in many ways. It gets at something, which is, it is kind of a surrogate for a food environment that favors food, patterns of food consumption that are not healthy. But the foods themselves, individual foods, just by virtue of fitting that definition of ultra processed, are not necessarily toxic to you. We at our house eat all kinds of frozen entrees and other foods that would qualify as ultra processed, and that doesn't mean that they are noxious. It just means that they tend to get included in a pattern of eating that doesn't promote good health. The problem is with the pattern of eating, and that pattern of eating is driven by more than just the food itself.
So, again, I forgive me for I don't mean to box you in, but does the federal government have a role in guiding that, or do they not?
Guiding what?
Those choices that people are making.
Well, that presumes, as many policymakers have, that this is a matter of choice. And so if you think the solution is to guide choices, then you're already well down the wrong path. Because
so you're saying consumers are eating these foods against their better judgment or awareness?
I'm saying that over a lifetime, the choices of the foods that you eat are not necessarily a matter of conscious choice. They are a function of the environment that you're living in, what the options are that you have available to you. They are a function of your biological, the functioning, your biological functions that drive you to eat to avoid starvation. They are functions of the stress that you live with that causes you to eat more and consume more calories than you might need for optimal health. They are the function of exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, which are ubiquitous, and drugs which cause you to gain weight. And so eating patterns are as much a result of obesity as they are a cause of obesity. But a lot of people who don't think about this all that much think it's just the opposite. In fact, they're certain of it. And I would argue that the idea that obesity is caused by those eating behaviors underlies the questions that you're asking right now.
So,
well,
let me
ask you, I know you want to jump in here, John. I'll pivot to you with this question asked by Russian novelist Tolstoy. What then must we do? Should we? Well, in the world I would create, Joe, you'd be handcuffed for having that Mountain Dew and it confiscated and fined. That's my solution.
That obviously you're speaking in jest. Let me do a little interpretation and extension of what I think I understand Ted giving you what should be a somewhat unsatisfying answer. I think the heart of this is there might be a place for more government intervention, state capacity, trying to shape our movement environment, our food environment, our stress environment. I think one of the recurring themes in Ted's work is we actually don't understand this well enough to know what that sort of structure or architecture should look like, so it would actually be net beneficial and weighed against the various constraints on personal choice that might involve. Is that it? Did I translate? Ted, you were not me. Yeah. Well, do you agree with my kind of interpolation of?
Yeah. When you start with false assumptions and you head down the road of very prescriptive policy based on false assumptions, you come up with unintended consequences that don't really help.
I mean, that Joe, you'll be surprised here. That appeals to me very much. That's aligned with my Hayekian outlook. In fact, I'd go a step further and say no central authority, not a newspaper, not an agency, can ever know all of those factors. And to attempt to control the outcomes based on the unknowable calculus you're doing is folly and will always lead to the bad consequences. I mean, there's a fascinating article you flagged in the New York Times that appears in print today, Joe, that I'll put up on the screen here, that gets at this, which is talking about how the various Ozempic, kind of drugs, these categories of drugs, are advancing so quickly in their formulations, and individual consumers are using them without FDA's direction, guidance, regulation, and it's resulting in all sorts of unexpected outcomes for a whole wide variety of conditions beyond just obesity. And I think, when I read it, it struck me in that way, Ted, that this can never be truly known. The FDA is deluded if they think that they can ever truly get a grasp on this. I mean, the New York Times says Technology moves fast, and we're rushing ahead with technology before understanding how it affects us. Well, I've got bad news for the New York Times. They can never understand. They will never understand that.
Well, I'll just take exception to that and say that I'm not a big fan of nihilism. I'm a bigger fan of curiosity. And I think we ought to start with curiosity and let go of the presumption that we know the answer and start looking for answers that are grounded in facts and evidence and science, and not take this ready, fire, aim approach that has been applied to obesity and food policy. A lot of people in the food policy sphere say, I know the answers. And in fact, I was sitting through a presentation about ultra-processed food and food noise when an academic said something like, sometimes it takes science years and years and years to figure out the answers that we already knew. Well, no, you are precisely wrong, my good person. You need to start with the curiosity to say, we don't know everything. You need to start with humility that says, we need to figure this out. But going to the opposite extreme of saying we can never understand this would have us still living in caves.
Well, maybe let me put a more precise point on that. The various consumers that are using these formulations that the New York Times points out are getting closer to understanding. And there are many patients they interviewed and described in the piece who experienced outcomes that were not foreseen and not anticipated by any central authority. And so in a sense, they are learning. I mean, I'll put it a different way. That's a better way to get at the understanding and a closer knowledge of how these things work than having a central authority dictate it, test it, formulate it, and then give permission to do it.
Yeah, that assumes that all of your science, well, no, let me take that back. The important thing is not to assume that all your science needs to be grounded in anecdotes. Rather, anecdotes provide the grounding for suppositions. Suppositions become the foundation for observational investigation, and then learnings from observational investigation become the groundwork for really rigorous testing, where you figure out exactly what is going on. And so I think all of that is important. I think you need to remain curious and humble and understand that we don't know everything.
Well, so can I push on this, Ted? Do you believe there's any finding in the nutrition obesity research pantheon that has achieved the level of certainty that would make it a reliable basis for policymaking?
That's an awfully broad question, and my glib answer would be to say that sure, there's probably something there that is well grounded, and and in general, there's some things that people are pretty good at agreeing on, which is it's good to eat whole foods in their natural state. It's a good idea not to consume excesses of any particular macronutrient, like too much sugar, too much fat, too much unprocessed carbohydrates, too much protein for that matter. Right now, protein is the darling child, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. But beyond that, to say that there is a prescriptive, that I, as the Secretary of HHS, should be able to say, this is the way you ought to eat. Well, no, sorry. We don't have the knowledge to do that kind of thing. And when we try and do that, we make mistakes.
And I think more than just harmful outcomes, also it's corrosive to public trust. I mean, look at the way, for example, that the current administration has inverted the food pyramid of dietary guidance from the federal government and turned it, as they put it, completely on its head.
Right.
Now, most Americans, I have a lot of clients that work in that space. We do a lot of work in the seafood industry, for example, and they've been jockeying and wrangling with the federal government for decades, as has every other food category, to try to get their particular product in a different, more preferable place on the food pyramid. That's a horrendous process. Like, you shouldn't even. It's terrible for the public that companies have to jockey in that way for the crony favor of the federal government. But worse, when they flip it on their heads, Ted, I think as a communicator, most ordinary Americans look at that and they don't think which one's right. Was it right before or right now? They look at it and say, these people can't be trusted on anything. If they can't even shoot straight with me about whether or not to drink milk, why should I believe them on anything else they ever say to me?
Lying to people never engenders trust, does it?
That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
Not a good idea. There's a lot of that goes on these days.
Well, I think that's right. And I mean, to my mind, that's an argument for junking the dietary guidelines altogether and getting the federal government out of the business of telling people what they should and shouldn't eat.
Well, yeah, it's not quite that simple. But what I will say is that we have met the enemy, and it is us. Mm-hmm. When you talk about the food environment, let's contrast the U.S. with France. Now, France has very clear ideas, and the French government has very clear ideas of what constitutes good, wholesome food. And you damn well better not try and sell the French public crap, because they take their food very, very seriously. But they also think we've sprouted two heads when we start talking about healthy eating, because I do not believe that food is medicine. Food is something entirely different from medicine. Now, there are very well-intended people who are promoting the idea that food is medicine, but they are not promoting food as a substitute for drugs. They are promoting the idea that patterns of eating have a lot to do with a person's health. Totally true. But when you tell your average Joe on the street that food is medicine, they start thinking, well, I can start shopping for food that says it is healthy and it will make me live forever. And when I find that food, I'll eat more and more of it so that I'll be more and more healthy. And guess what? It has just the opposite effect. The French people, as a culture, say that is nonsense. Yeah. Food is for pleasure. Food is a social activity. Food is a cultural thing. And they take it quite seriously, but they don't try and turn it into medicine, a drug.
Yeah, and
what country has the lowest incidence of obesity in the world? Perhaps you could probably the large, well-developed country that has among the lowest.
I was going to guess Sudan, but
tell me. France. Well, famine has a way of reducing the prevalence of obesity, but that's not a really good.
Well, I'm struck about what you said about the cultural phenomenon, and I think therein may lie some common ground here, because ordinary Americans, ordinary French people can arrive at sensible approaches to these issues on their own initiative, with their own autonomy and based on their own collective wisdom. And
I think an interaction of culture and government. So the government will not let you jump into France and sell crap. Yeah. But I mean, the reason they can do that is because the society has strong ideas of what good food is. And so there's an overlap. There's an intersection. It's not all or nothing, and it's not nihilistic. Well, it's like we're going to protect our cultural heritage around food.
So it doesn't bother you? It doesn't bother you that they outlaw particular kinds of food?
It doesn't. I'm not an authority on French food regulations, other than to say that I know that there are food ingredients that just never get in the door.
Right. So when you say they won't let you sell crap there, you think that's commendable?
You bet. You bet. Things that are not things that are not really in the public's best interest coming in and being sold with very little thought. And this, to a certain extent, I'm not here to endorse RFK Jr. by any stretch, but I will say that his idea that we let food ingredients in just a little bit too easily in the U.S. and we ought to take a little bit more care in what we let into the food supply in the U.S. as other countries do take more care than we do.
Well, let me pivot to our second topic, Joe, with an anecdote I think you will find amusing. I have many European friends, Ted, and I live in New York City. My next door neighbor's from Milan. She often has European dinner parties, and I was pushing their buttons recently at a recent dinner party. I think Americans are not only unhealthy, they think we're also, garish and tasteless. And so
how would they get that idea?
I told them that I was going to try to start a company that made nacho cheese foie gras, where we would force feed Doritos to geese, and it would be a really popular American product. They went bananas. But I want to touch on, Ted, a second thing that's really jumped out at me in your coverage, and it's about the coverage of the Center for Science in the Public Interest, which is a long-standing, highly visible activist group food activist group that gets a ton of ink, and they are an offshoot of the Ralph Nader consumer activism movement that gained traction in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And I would venture to say, get more publicity than almost any other advocates on these issues. And in some parts of your coverage, as here, Ted, you point out that they use overheated rhetoric, as you call it, lots of hyperbole, and in this case are trying to forbid whole milk from being served in schools. And
trying to forbid it. It has been forbidden, and the lid has only recently been taken off that.
Right. Well, they're in favor of that in any case. And you chastise them here gently, and also their notion that the food industry, or as they call it, big dairy, is running an elaborate PR campaign to cast doubt on the science of saturated fat. So, I mean, I've studied CSPI for many, many, many years on a variety of different client campaigns, and I share your view about their methods and their hyperbole. I mean, why don't I just pause there? My question is, what's your view on how they get at this? Is this the kind of approach that you're cautioning against?
Not for a minute would I want to force CSPI to wear a black hat. What I would say is that on the subject of saturated fat in dairy foods, the science increasingly seems to be telling us that we made a mistake when we said all saturated fat is bad. There's plenty of convincing evidence that says that diets that are heavy in saturated fat cause problems, but it appears to me that not all saturated fat is a pretty broad brush, and the saturated fat in the burger that I had a couple days ago is not quite the same as the saturated fat in a glass of whole milk. And in fact, it seems that when youth drink whole milk, their risk of obesity is lower than it is when they drink skim milk.
Well, I noticed in other cases you showcased CSPI's work and seem to me to be pleased about what they're arguing here. For example,
but you're expecting Ted to be. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Jim, but I'm going to. Which is, Ted's not a follower of any particular kind of group or voice. Ted he taught me the Voltaire cherish those who seek the truth, doubt those who have found it. And I see Ted as someone who really tries to apply that razor to all of this stuff. and doesn't get called in or pulled into some tribal understanding of any set of evidence. And as you and I go over ad nauseum, when some branch of science gets infiltrated and enwebbed by polarization and moralization, the struggle to understand where is truth and its convergence is almost impossible. So with that play, I'll let Ted answer for his damn self.
I don't wish to paint Ted into a corner. What I'm trying to say is that we can't just look at these issues like a monk in a lean-to prayer hut in the Himalayas.
I've never been to the Himalayas and never slept in a prayer hut.
Well, CSPI, they aren't just on a soapbox venting their spleen. They're trying to leverage public policy and legislative and regulatory outcomes. And
I think it's entirely possible that sometimes CSPI is right and sometimes they're wrong.
And that's what I'm pointing out. Yeah, indeed. And here, for example,
but where have you noticed CSPI to be right about something?
I'm featuring it right here on the screen with their.
I think there's nothing wrong with saying, God, this is stupid. I mean, yeah, who needs a 3,000 calorie breakfast burrito?
Well, but the answer to that is the hundreds of thousands of customers that go to Cheesecake Factory to buy it.
I see nothing wrong with, as they would certainly do in France, pointing out that that's an obscene entree. There, now when you try and take it to the point of saying, and I will put you in jail if you eat it, that would be a mistake. But no, there's nothing wrong with saying, as a cultural norm, we think this is probably a pretty bad idea.
Well, okay, but those hundreds of thousands of customers, I don't think there's a single person who walks through the door of Cheesecake Factory expecting it to be healthy, and they're aware of that critique and have opted to go there anyway.
Food supply doesn't exist in a vacuum, does it?
I'm not sure I follow you.
I'm suggesting that an unhealthy food supply is as much a function of the prevalence of obesity as it is the cause. Mm-hmm. And what people are starting, one of the things which Julia did not mention in her article in the Times, but one of the things that is becoming apparent to food manufacturers is that as we deal with the biological problem of obesity, food preferences are changing. Mm-hmm. And so Cheesecake Factory might find that they have a shrinking market for their obscenely unhealthy, seemingly unhealthy foods. And what we're seeing is that food manufacturers are shifting their commercial strategies, realizing that they cannot prosper in the future by selling ever larger quantities of relatively poor quality food. Instead, they are starting to look for strategies to trade people up to a higher quality of food and charge premium prices. Sounds like a good thing to me, but it doesn't come from the government saying, we'll put you in jail if you sell this or if you eat this. Right. It comes from changing the environment, part of which is the prevalence of obesity in the population, which drives a poor quality food environment.
Right. And let me press on that a little bit, because I think you're touching on something really important that overlaps with communications too. And it's the notion of how American consumers react when they feel they're being scolded or condescended in a way. So I'll give you an example. You may recall about 15 years ago in New York City, the New York Times wrote what is widely regarded as the worst restaurant review in the history of the paper. And their restaurant top food critic, a guy named Pete Wells, absolutely blowtorched a restaurant called Guy Fieri's American Grill in Times Square for a lot of the exact same reasons you're describing, that it was unhealthy, obscene, overindulgent, portions too large, food was, too rich and appealed to, the lowest impulses of food consumers. And a strange thing happened. Unlike most restaurants that get bad reviews, sales and attendance and visitors at that restaurant went up And there was a kind of antipathy reaction. People read that and thought, you know what? I'm going to reject what the New York Times is telling me. I feel like I'm being patronized by them. I'm going to go eat there anyway. Do you see that phenomenon at all? Do you think about how that plays out?
I don't think that scolding is a real good public policy strategy in general, and it's certainly not a good strategy for dealing with obesity. And yet, it's been a primary policy that we've pursued either implicitly or explicitly, and it's been precisely counterproductive. The only thing that is produced is weight bias and stigma, which has been shown to actually compound the problem of obesity, because people respond to being stigmatized by feeling stress, and stress triggers biological responses that result in an increased drive to eat, which results in more obesity, which results in more stigma, which becomes a very vicious cycle. It's just it's a dumb way to go about it. But it gets back to this basic presumption that I've been yammering on about, which is it's not a behavioral problem. The behavior results from obesity. It's not what causes obesity. That doesn't mean that you can ignore the behavior. It means that you need to pay attention to the biology. And here's the good news. People are paying attention to the biology now. And that comes through in Julia Belluz's article, and it comes through in the public discourse. But not everybody gets it. Joe asked, when he asked me to do this, to think about 3 nuggets to think about. And here are 3 very simple nuggets.
Just lightly processed nuggets.
Slightly processed, minimally processed nuggets. Yes. One is that obesity is complex. Simple answers are usually simply wrong. It is chronic. It's not something that you fix by losing weight. When someone has obesity, they have obesity, and that disordered biology is not going to just, at least with the therapies that we have right now, not just going to disappear with a one and done intervention. A lot of people think it will, but it won't. And then finally, it's driven by biology more than behavior.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to touch on an overlap that I sense in the tobacco harm reduction work that Joe and I do so much of. And I know you mentioned your background in that space too, Ted. And I'm struck at how there are activists, what I would call hardline activists in the food space, people like Michael Bloomberg, for example, or Mitch Zeller, who was the head of the Center for Tobacco Products, who simultaneously have these fanatical obsessions with regulating and restricting food choices, and also have the same parallel zealotry about low-risk nicotine products. I cannot, for the life of me, get my head around why that should be so. Why do some of these food hardliners also have this huge antipathy for nicotine?
I would say, just as my own speculation, that what happens, and frustrates me greatly, is that people look at the success of tobacco control efforts and say, well, food is like tobacco. Mm-hmm. And we need to learn from our successes in tobacco and apply it in food. And that's a prescription for failure, because food is not like tobacco. We can live without tobacco. We can't live without food.
Well, Joe,
it's as simple as that.
Joe, let me put a question to you, if I may, because this touches on your affinity for state capacity. When Ted says that those campaigns were successful, one of the measures of that is they were able to implement public policy and regulations and new laws and get the government involved. And that's exactly what all the food companies that Ted alluded to from my friends at the Grocery Manufacturers Association are trying to do all the time, or my clients in the canned tuna industry are always trying to do. And a laundry list of other jockeying constituencies are trying to get the federal government to do. And sometimes they win, and sometimes they lose, and sometimes they jockey, and sometimes it reverses, and sometimes the food pyramid goes upside down. And we all end up in this great Thunderdome of trying to, like crabs in a bucket, climb over the other guy to be the king of idiot mountain, when in fact, consumers ought to be making those choices for themselves. When you look at that, the history of food policy or the history of nicotine policy, and the calamitous, chaotic, cronyist Thunderdome that it's become, does it ever give you pause in your faith about state capacity?
Well, I'd like to think that my commitment to the utility of state capacity has more nuance than just good versus bad. I certainly am not going to defend every extension of the state into choice and behavior as a good thing. I do believe that it could be and can be a good thing. And I can certainly imagine a world where the levers of the state are actually tilting the environment and people's choices in a direction where it enhances public welfare and reduces harm. But it's rare that all of those competing forces see enough shared interest to actually align behind that. I think in our world of nicotine, there is this rare window right damn now, to try to achieve that. But none of this is straightforward, simple, and easy, and none of it is without risk to reputation or feelings.
Well,
I mean, that was a word salad, but what am I going to do?
I mean, what worries me is that we're all just, if once you enter into that game theory of these jockeying constituencies trying to wrangle the federal government to do the right thing or pursue, eliminate the bad thing, we all just become, horses in the Kentucky Derby betting on our particular winner. I mean, let me show I was really struck. There's a great article in ConscienHealth, which I'll put on a link in the thread, about all these proliferating documentaries about food policy. In my world, I want a documentary about the documentary filmmakers, these trustafarian rich kids who go out and kick McDonald's in the shins. And in this case, they did one called Cowspiracy, and this one's all like pro-veganism. You know what? Good for them. God bless them. But it scares the living daylights out of me that someday in the future, people like this might be in charge of the levers of power, just as you're horrified, Joe, that RFK's now at the steering wheel. But don't you see, by entering into that game in the first place, which you, I think, regard as a good thing, that's the world we end up. We're all at the craps table hoping that our chip hits on the right number.
Well, and so that is a central distinction between how you and I look at the world. Ted, for your benefit, there's a classic segment where, I say, well, I want FDA Center for Tobacco Products to use its tools to reshape a market that enhances welfare and blah, blah, blah. And Jim says, I want the staff escorted out of the building. I want bulldozers and wrecking balls. And then I want the earth salted so nothing can ever grow there again. Right. So we come at this in a very different way. And I think, to try to be fair to Jim's perspective, it has become increasingly difficult for me to mount a vigorous defense of the actions of our federal regulators when it comes to this category. But that doesn't mean that there isn't so much latent opportunity for them to contribute positively.
If only the right guy got at the steering wheel, right, Joe?
Can I suggest something?
Please jump in, Ted.
I would suggest that the answer is not to ping between two options in a false dichotomy. It is possible that maybe we need a reset. Maybe we're coming at this wrong. Maybe we need to be curious about what would actually work. Maybe you're mistaken, Jim, when you talk about letting consumers choose, make their own food choices, or Or the only other alternative is to have a nanny state which determines what is bad food and bans it. I don't think either of those extremes are helpful, because in fact, people do not freely make choices about food. They make choices within the food environment into which they are born. And when people go to France, a healthier food environment, they make better choices and enjoy their food more. And when people come from France to the US, they make worse choices, and many of them wind up developing obesity by virtue of living in a less healthy food environment. What makes it less healthy? We really don't fully know, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and figure it out.
Good, well taken. Point well taken, Ted. And it makes me think of. I think we've talked on the show before about how I think we've kind of run that experiment in the tobacco harm reduction space. I mean, in a way, the New York Times article we flagged earlier gets at that too. The various compounds of GLP-1 variants are running their own experiment. People are using these without permission or authorization in their own way and their own outcomes. And so I don't know, that's happening. It's interesting to look at, and I think puts to the test what you're describing, Ted. But there's an example in THR2 I want to flag, and it gets back to a piece that Joe wrote for ConscienHealth 10 years ago, Joe. And this is it was praising our friends Mitch Zeller and Scott Gottlieb when they put out their plan in 2017 about the future of nicotine regulatory policy. And Ted, what I mean is, prior to FDA and Center for Tobacco Products declaring that it had authority over vaping, people were using those products in more or less a free and open market. And they were educating one another, and it was happening, as you described, in a cultural way. There was a whole culture of vaping that supported itself and learned from one another, and it was decentralized. And in that process, prior to the regulatory regime, hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of Americans successfully quit smoking with these products, which I think is indisputably a good outcome. But then Zeller and Gottlieb got control of the steering wheel. And here's what Joe talks about what they did. They describe a future where nicotine may still be used by those who want or need it, but where the smoking of tobacco would be very rare. Joe points out the pillars of the plan are to foster innovation for non-combustible products while also setting a product standard to reduce nicotine levels. And he says that the greatest challenge to this is that more than 80% of smokers wrongly believe that nicotine causes cancer. Joe, my question to you is, did FDA make good on that promise?
Did they were they carefully reading
that vision come to pass? No, did the vision you described, where they would foster innovation, and bring these products to market and set straight public misperceptions, did they make any progress toward those goals?
Not nearly as much as anyone would have hoped. And to be fair, there are lots of people who lay a lot of the blame on my current client, not my client at the time, but that the adoption of Juul Labs products in the 2017, 18, 19 led to such a crisis that these well-intended notions in July of 2017 were no longer viable or politically tenable.
Well,
I don't think that's the whole story, but I think lots of people.
I want to hear Ted's view on this. I don't want to put Ted on the spot, but I do want to put you on the spot, which is, are American smokers, were they better off before CTP got control of that regulation, or are they better off today?
My ignorant supposition would be that CTP made virtually no difference, that the Puritans in our midst had their way, as they would have had regardless, decrying the evils of nicotine and convincing the public that nicotine products that are in fact purer and safer than the delivery of nicotine in combusted tobacco smoke is more dangerous. And I have a close relative who just passed away who said, "Oh no, I don't want to use those damn patches. They're dangerous. I want to keep on smoking my cigarettes." Didn't work out well for him.
It's tragic. It's tragic. That's a story we've heard.
That is not. I would not blame that on Mitch Zeller and the Office of Tobacco Products. I would blame it as the culture that we're living in that favors a righteous Puritan to protect the children from the evil companies that almost certainly they believe are trying to hook children on these products and doom them to lives of dependence on nicotine.
But well, Joe, again, I want to put you on the spot on that question. Are we better off before CTP got control of regulating these products, or are we better off in the 10 years since they've had the steering wheel?
That's a difficult question. It feels harder for me to argue that we're better off than that we're worse off.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Joe. Do you think CTP, or is it CTP or OTP? Or
the Center for Tobacco Products. It's one of
did CTP actually get control of the steering wheel, or do they exist in a world where lots of people are fiddling with the steering wheel?
So I think that is a very good question, and it highlights the wisdom of the Churchill quote that a representative democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other kinds. Center for Tobacco Products has a lot of influence up to a point. It's part of the Food and Drug Administration, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, which is part of the executive branch of the government. And to Ted's point about culture and the importance of pre-existing beliefs that are resistant to change, I do cling to the belief that if the Center for Tobacco Products had full direction and control over what was going to happen, I think we would be in a very different place. But that's not the world in which we find ourselves. And the challenge then turns on how do we persuade enough of the right people to see things in. No, you just Jim's just like, no, give people choice, get out of the way.
Joe, it's like you're describing a labyrinth. Oh, it's got lots of twists and turns. Oh, some parts are really dark. It's awfully scary in there. It's easy to get lost. In the middle, there's a minotaur. And you're just saying, well, if we only turn this way and left instead of right, the answer is don't enter the labyrinth.
So really, Jim, I hear you saying that public policy is a simple thing. Just make one choice at the outset, and all will be well.
Not all will be well. I mean, I guess the way I would say it is
stay away from that minotaur.
The way I would say it is individual liberty and giving, letting individual Americans make their own choices. Yes, with good information. Yes, with good science, and yes, with sifting good guidance from bad guidance, and yes, cultural inputs. But at the end of the day, letting them have autonomy is the least worst of all the other options. I don't say that leads to a utopian sunlit upland. I'm saying it's the least worst of our choices. It comes with risks. Riding a motorcycle comes with risks. Eating a Cheesecake Factory breakfast burrito comes with risks. So too does vaping. And individual people can make those choices on a kaleidoscopic variety of inputs, some of them intuitive, as you point out, based on they don't even fully realize. But it can never be controlled, can never be fully known, and it's attempting to do so makes it far worse than letting individual people bear the burden of that risk.
I'm not a fan of giving people the freedom to pump toxins into the air that I must breathe.
Well, I think what you're talking about is the limits of liberty when it hurts other people. And I think I share that view. And I think a robust civil litigation structure is crucial to protect us against that. You're right. You should not be able to harm others. That's true.
I don't think an adversarial litigation environment is the only way to get there. I think that has a role to play. Sure. I've got 2 lawyers for sons.
Yeah.
But I also think that having civil discourse, living in community with other people, in a culture where we respect the needs of other people and the harm that we might cause other people.
Yeah.
And so, a business enterprise that seeks to sell harmful products to our children is probably not a good thing. And our children and their parents shouldn't have the freedom to choose these things that are foisted upon them necessarily. I think we need to make some collective decisions. It's not a strict dichotomy. It is a complex problem to solve more often than not. Sad to say.
Well, let me try to wrap up. The hours seem to zip by, and I feel like we could talk about this sort of stuff all afternoon. And here's hoping we can keep the conversation to be continued, Ted. We ask all of our guests and ourselves as well at the end of a lot of our shows: are you optimistic or pessimistic about where nicotine policy is headed as of today? And I'll expand that, Ted, to include obesity policy. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about where we're headed on those 2 tracks?
I feel unqualified to say where we're headed on nicotine policy. I don't, from my very limited view of things, I don't see a lot of room for optimism, simply because I think there's still a vilification of nicotine products that would leave people much better off. And I have friends and family who have drunk the Kool-Aid that says, damn, those vapes are dangerous, I got to keep smoking. I think that's a travesty. And so I don't know why I should be optimistic. That doesn't mean that there are not reasons to be optimistic, because, for one thing, I think Joe Gitchell is a guy that I respect, who's going to push for good things. And
Ted, you were so credible up until this.
I believe he'll get there. Well, no, I'm sorry, I do. On obesity, policy related to obesity, we are definitely headed in the right direction. And one of the most encouraging things that I see is the fact that as people have access to care for obesity that's grounded in science and medicine, the folks who shape the environment that they live in are saying, oh my God, we're going to be screwed if we don't adapt. So they're adapting. I think we could get ourselves into a virtuous circle, and maybe we are. But that's my optimism speaking.
And Joe, how do you view it? Is the F in the FDA headed in the right direction or the wrong direction? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about where HHS and FDA are steering food policy?
I think, and I think you both get to feel quite vindicated in this regard. I think the mechanism that Ted just outlined, that there now is a big population of people who are finally getting realistic, adequate care for a biological response to their intersection with the food and other environments that they confront, that will set up a cascade where the food environment is going to change. And that will end up helping lots of people who don't take GLP-1s, because their choices are going to be better for their metabolic well-being.
How do you mean?
How much will our federal regulators guide that constructively or not? I'm going to cling to the hope, just because I think there's so much opportunity to move things in positive directions more quickly if we can direct and shape these influences in a positive direction, I think it's too big an opportunity not to at least try to do it, even if it leads to the scrambling and crackling of crabs in a barrel.
Okay, I've mangled so many metaphors in this show.
I know.
I lost track of them. Well, again, Ted, Kyle from ConscienHealth, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to put links to everything we've touched on in our chat. We can keep the convo going there. Here's hoping we can persuade you to come back again. And Joe Gitchell, since you're enjoying your Mountain Dew, I may change your new nickname handle to the Fourth Horseman of the Esophagus for our next show.
Whatever works. And did people see my cool Raygun shirt? How cool is that?
Science is my love language. Okay, that's great. I'm going to get
talking
some of this.
about. Well, thank you for helping us all getting less wrong. That's all we can aspire to. Thank you.
Yeah, it's
Ted.
been a really stimulating convo, Ted. So thanks again. It's Jim McCarthy with American Vapor Manufacturers. For Ted, Kyle, and Joe Gitchell, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.